I'm going to ask Professor Fogenauer to introduce our next speaker. Professor Fogenauer.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. That's my privilege this afternoon to announce our next speaker, Jasper Kunstreich, who's based here at the Frankfurt Institute for European Legal History, and who has a very interesting career trajectory. He started life as a history, politics, and law student at the University of Heidelberg. Then after his bachelor degree, he moved on to the University of Oxford, where he did his master's degree in economic and social history, followed immediately by a doctorate in economic and social history, but as you might say, also in legal history, because it was on the development of insolvency regulation in various German territories between 1815 and 1871. After successfully completing the PhD, he came here to Frankfurt, mostly with a view to a research project that he's going to present in a minute. So I'm not going to speak on this much longer, but he's also the social media officer here of our institute. So whenever you get a Twitter alert or a newsletter from our institute, it's normally Jasper Kunstreich's doing. And also, just on the side, in parallel to doing all of this, he finished his first state exam in law, or is about to finish his first state exam in law. It's only a matter of days or weeks. So he is the ideal speaker for tonight's lecture, and I'm going to hand over to him now.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And so I hope you can see, you should now be seeing my screen, and I'll just jump into the topic. Tonight I'll be talking about the legal cluster within the Max Planck Society. What you see here is a timeline that leads up to the present state of that legal cluster. Why am I talking about a cluster? Well, firstly, it's by mere observation that legal scholarship makes up a significant part of the humanities section. So here you see a timeline leading up to the legal cluster in the current form. And today's talk will primarily focus on this bit here, the decade between 1956 and 1966, which I identify as the founding period of the legal cluster, the time when a number of internal obstacles had to be overcome to firmly establish a significant number of law-related institutes that henceforth couldn't be ignored by the Max Planck Society in their planning. There is another reason why I speak of a cluster. I'm myself part of a research program, the GMPG project, that investigates the post-war history of the Max Planck Society, and we came up with the term cluster as an analytical concept to describe the MPG's scientific structure. There are certain topical agglomerations within the Max Planck Society, and we decided to call those agglomerations a cluster. They exist in different forms of, you could say, togetherness, and it's just a very telling example that by forming Max Planck Law, the legal cluster has taken to a very solid institutionalized structure. In addition to the legal cluster, there are a couple of other clusters which are listed here. And you will remark in this list that the legal cluster is the only one from the humanities and social sciences. This is not to say that there are no humanities and social sciences being done in the Max Planck Society, quite on the contrary, but they are more solitary and don't necessarily form a cluster. So my question in this talk is, how did the lawyers manage to create their own cluster? And this process took place in the years between roughly 1956 and 1966. I will explicitly focus on the foundation of two institutes, namely the Institute of Legal History and the Institute for Criminal Law. And I apologize to my colleagues from Munich, from Innovation and Competition, because their institute also moved into the Max Planck Society around that time, but there's only so much time we have tonight, and so I can't delve into that part, but you are there on the horizon. But before I delve into that story, I'd like to introduce a bit of the prehistorical context. As you know, the Max Planck Society had a predecessor, the Kaiser Wilhelm Gesellschaft, and that was disbanded in 1945. In the Kaiser Wilhelm Gesellschaft, there had already existed a humanities section with two law institutes, the one for private law and the one for public international law. In 1948, the Max Planck Society was established, and as far as the humanities section is concerned, the early years were devoted to restoring that original section with their institutes. And so that happened with the two institutes, here with Hans Dölle as director of the Private Law Institute and Konrad Zweigert as a scientific member. And in Heidelberg, the Institute for Foreign and International Public Law, under the directorship of first Karl Bilfinger and later, who was soon succeeded by Hermann Mosler. In addition, there was the Bibliotheca Hertziana in Rome and the Institute for History in Göttingen under Hermann Heimpel. So this process of restoration was completed by 1956 roughly, and it had become by that time it had become a very attractive set of institutes that enjoyed freedom from teaching, elasticity in their organization, and generous funding. And as we all know, these are timeless and traits that academics seek out. So naturally, other academic fields and other scholarly networks became interested in advancing into the MPG. And what we see from 1957 onwards is that there are a couple of proposals for new humanities institutes that reached the section. One of them was the 17-page proposal written in 1958 by Erich Gensmer, an eminent legal historian at the University of Hamburg. He suggested an institute for comparative legal history and medieval Roman law. It is also a tale of the various jealousies that sometimes structure a research field, as the proposal was not well received among the legal history community. Gensmer's peers, among them Viaca and Pringsheim, criticized it as an attempt to centralize legal history, and they feared a monopoly position of such an institute. So in 1959, the Rechtshistorikertag, which is the biggest German-speaking legal history conference, discussed the proposal at length and suggested alternatives that would have effectively marginalized the institute. Yet Gensmer had activated his links to Hans Dölle, who was his colleague at the Hamburg Law Faculty, and to Helmut Kohing, his former student, now professor in Frankfurt. Gensmer and Kohing would coordinate closely in the coming years and approach the issue like policymakers. A lot of private talks, a lot of correspondences, and making sure that the right expert opinions were drafted at the right time. So here is a letter from Gensmer to Kohing, and he writes in this bit here, he writes, "The whole thing has now arrived at a stage where it would be useful if you could start approaching the Max Planck Society, and it could be very effective." So both effectively outmaneuvered their skeptical colleagues in the legal history community. How did the humanities section respond? At the time, Hermann Mosler served as the section's chair. He feared that the establishment of a new institute would cause trouble both within the Max Planck Society and within the greater research framework in Germany. The minutes from the section meeting have him saying that the project mustn't be considered isolated from other plans, and that Gensmer's proposal is difficult to realize because an all-encompassing figure and personality in legal history does not exist. Comparative legal history would thus become a confederation of multiple university institutes. However, a Max Planck Institute's very reason of existence, in Mosler's words, is that it can do something that cannot equally be done at universities. So the section decided to confer the question to a special commission headed by Hermann Heimpel, the director of the Göttingen Institute, and Mosler himself went on to prepare a sort of conversation among the Max Planck Society about the issue. And he pitched He pitched it as a pivotal issue for the very legitimacy of the humanities section within the Max Planck Society. And indeed, the establishment of an Institute for Legal History was not unanimously welcomed in the Max Planck Society, but faced with an existential question that pertained to the freedom to decide which fields of research to pursue or not, Mosler managed to rally support. And Mosler rightly anticipated resistance from the Länder, which up until now were the primary funding source of the Max Planck Society. The Länder soon objected to the idea that the Max Planck Society should host new humanities and social sciences institutes, as this would threaten research undertaking at universities and at academies of sciences. So, while the Max Planck Society, on the other hand, naturally claimed that it should be free from any state intervention in making their decision about new research projects. So this line of conflict between the funding bodies and the scientific or academic bodies of the Max Planck Society emerged visibly by 1961. By now, Helmut Koing had positioned himself as the ideal candidate for the new directorship. He was very well connected and had demonstrated his abilities as a science politician during his tenure as rector of the Frankfurt University, his directorship at the Frankfurt Institute for International Economic Law, and as founding president of the German Wissenschaftsrat. He had also been very apt in identifying the section's concerns about Gensmer's proposal, and he understood the need to narrow the original proposal down to a more pragmatic project. And there was another problem with Gensmer's proposal, and that was Gensmer himself. As Dölle pointed out, the MPG is not going to give someone an institute who is about to retire. Even though Koing had initially paired up with Erich Gensmer, he signaled to Hans Dölle and Mosler in various letters that he would be willing to accommodate the suggested changes, and I quote, "if my person should happen to be chosen," end of quote. After a number of private calls and talks between Gensmer and Koing, we merely know that they happened. Unfortunately, we don't know anything about the content, but after a number of talks, Gensmer refrained from his former ambitions to become director of the new institute, and Koing emerged as the only candidate, quite predictably so. From now on, the other section members would include him in their internal discussions, and he became part of a special commission under the chairmanship of Hermann Mosler. And that commission had the goal to file a special report on the question whether or not the Max Planck Society should be allowed to have research institutes in the humanities. It's the Mosler report that should serve the Max Planck Society as ammunition in their bargaining with the Länder. So between 1962 and 1964, there are at least 4 or 5 different drafts of this paper circulating, but what I find most interesting is the fact that in all versions, there is a significant passage that evokes a sort of esprit de corps among the members of the humanities section. It's underlined here in this picture, and it says, "The scholars involved have developed a sense of community that makes the Max Planck Society a special scientific corporation." I'm actually wondering to which extent that addresses all section members, or whether it mainly has its lawyers in mind. Because the lawyers already make up 50% of the section members, they are marked red here, and it is hard to dispute that during the 1950s and 1960s, lawyers had a fairly stable set of shared beliefs, traits, behaviors, in short, a sort of common habitus. And in addition to the so-called and never clearly defined strictly legal point of view, that included a certain systemic conservatism, a familiarity with each other in a comparatively small field, and not to mention the fact that they were all male, a gentleman's club in which women only entered the room to take the minutes. And now enter the criminal lawyers. The fact that the Max Planck Society was about to establish a new Institute for Legal History did of course not go unnoticed. The criminal lawyers had a history of trying to enter first the Kaiser Wilhelm Gesellschaft and later the MPG. There were first proposals already in 1938, and a serious plan was tabled in the Senate in 1942, but never materialized. 10 years later, in 1952, Paul Bockelmann, professor for criminal law and criminology in Göttingen, approached the Max Planck Society with a new proposal for an institute, I quote, researching the effects and impacts of punishment. There is a supporting letter by his colleague Friedrich Schaffstein that points to a dire gap in the MPG's portfolio with regard to producing academic offspring for the field of criminal law. Here it says, such an institute would clearly fulfill a similar function as the institutes for private and public law in training and forming young scholars. Scholarship in criminal law up until now direly misses out on a comparable institution for young scholars. Hans Dölle, the director for the Institute for Foreign and International Private Law, dismissed the proposal because of its heavy focus on sociology and criminology, and because there already existed an institute in Freiburg that could fulfill this purpose, at least in his opinion. And that was Adolf Schönke's Institute for Comparative and Foreign Criminal Law at the university. Schönke was acquainted with Dölle through the German Society for Comparative Law, and he also maintained strong links with Walter Strauss, who served as state secretary in the Federal Justice Ministry between 1949 and 1963. Schönke and Strauss both also sought incorporation of the Freiburg Institute into the Max Planck Society, but first to no avail. In 1952, as I mentioned, the humanities section was still very busy restoring their old institutes, and this and the fact that Schönke suddenly died in 1953 led to the establishment of an independent research institute in Freiburg as a Landesstiftung under the new directorship of Hans-Heinrich Jeschek. But that was only for the time being. When in 1960, the newly elected MPG president Adolf Butenandt explained in a TV interview that the MPG seeks to expand into all fields that are, I quote, accessible to the human spirit and intelligence, end of quote, Germany's criminal lawyers listened carefully. So another attempt was now made by the German Criminological Society in Frankfurt that reactivated Paul Bockelmann, as well as by the Freiburg Institute that could rely on their political patron, Walter Strauss, who approached the Max Planck Society, so the Max Planck president, directly. So what's interesting to highlight here is that contrary to the legal history community that had been a bit reserved about the prospect of an MPI, the criminal lawyers felt that they actually deserved to have their proper Max Planck Institute, and they pursued those plans. Now, the renewed application submitted by Walter Strauss happens in 1961, in the middle of the aforementioned discussions, and it now shifts the conversation towards a new logic. Up until now, the scholarly argument in support of the Legal History Institute had been methodological. An institute for legal history would support the ongoing research in comparative law, as comparisons always include a historical dimension. Now, with the application for an institute in criminal law, the argument became disciplinary. It was about filling the gap, conforming to the traditional tripartition of German legal scholarship into private, public, and criminal law. And it's a whole new aspiration to represent the entirety of legal scholarship within the Max Planck Society. And yet this is what happens when you combine methodological with disciplinary arguments. It allows you to ask what's missing, what should we add? It's nothing that was made explicit, probably because it would have been a significant departure from the Harnack principle. If an organization focuses on covering a disciplinary spectrum, then the focus shifts away from the individual personality and towards a sort of systemic thinking, which is quite prototypical for German lawyers, I guess. It might also have been the answer legal scholarship found to an ever-increasing, already in the 60s, ever-increasing competitive scientific environment with its rankings, prize-winning, and citations, in which legal scholarship came to look a bit misplaced. But that also meant that within the humanities section, it was no longer merely a question of whether or not the Max Planck Society should be allowed to do research in the humanities, but also whether the section would accept a substantial expansion of legal scholarship that would arguably skew the balance in their favor. This is in 1962, and by now Dölle has retired from his directorship in Hamburg and has become vice president of the Max Planck Society. His successor, Konrad Zweigert, who had been scientific member since the early 50s, is now the person that travels through the Republic and attends a great number of committee meetings necessary to convince the governing bodies, and Mosler is still heading the commission, the special commission, and supplies the intellectual equipment by way of his report. Koing, meanwhile, is trying to get the Wissenschaftsrat to publish a favorable passage in their soon-to-be-published Empfehlungen. Zweigert also actively pursues the incorporation of the Munich-based Institute for International Copyright and Patent Law. So by now we have 3 proposals for 3 new institutes, and that is the point where I would say the legal cluster materializes within the section. The most outspoken piece of evidence can be found in the minutes of the section meeting on October 13th, 1962, where the section simply admits it. And I quote, "The chair mentions an occasionally voiced concern regarding the imbalance within the section. He holds, however, the opinion that the section does not need to attend a special balance of subjects analogous to universities. A certain predominance of law-related institutes ought to be accepted. This section agrees." However, this all remained a mere, and we can now come to the final part, it all remained a mere declaration of intent as long as the funding was not yet secured. This would occupy the Max Planck Society another 2 years as the Länder formed a strong resistance. Firstly, law belonged to the traditional core curriculum of universities, and hence in the traditional domain of Landespolitik. Secondly, they objected that law does not require fancy machines, telescopes, and other expensive equipment, therefore it could and should be done at universities. And lastly, and probably most importantly, they objected to the procedure by which the Max Planck Society unilaterally decided to establish new institutes without prior consent by the funding body. Although Helmut Koing had already received his appointment as director from the MPG, the Länder refused to accept the new institute for the budget 1963. The finance minister of Lower Saxony reportedly said, "Who pays may also call the tune. Wer zahlt, schafft an." The Max Planck Society, on the other hand, was determined to fend off what they saw as an attempt to interfere with their decision to embark on new research. In the meantime, Walter Strauss, the mighty supporter in the Ministry of the Justice Ministry, resigned over the infamous Spiegel affair. But the federal government came to help at last. The secretary in the Ministry of Science, Wolfgang Cartellieri, openly addressed the MPG Senate in 1964, asking them to maintain pressure and continue with their endeavor to establish new law-related institutes, simply because the federal government had a vital interest in the realization of those projects, particularly in Freiburg and Munich. That same year, the federal government entered into the budget negotiations. Henceforth, the MPG budget would be funded 50% by the Länder and 50% by the federal government. So the long awaiting paid off. The lawyers had established their cluster and single-handedly also produced a complete overhaul of the MPG funding structure. So here, this is my final point. You see the takeoff in funding after the cluster has been established. We stop in 1997, though, with our analysis simply because the financial data for the 2000s have not been released yet, but I would have a guess how it continues. Namely, there will most likely be another increase as new institutes were added in the 2000s, but it was probably less steep than in the 60s and 70s, simply because there is another trend, and that trends look like this, and it is the overall share in the MPG budget that goes into law, and this has continuously been decreasing, except for this little spike here that relates to the period I've just spoken about. And on this jolly note, I guess I end here and am open to your questions. Thank you very much.
If there are any questions, they could be typed into the chat.
There are none.
It is a little bit depressing. Obviously, we think of ourselves as pure and humble researchers, but there's a lot of politics going on, as always, behind the scenes. Of course, the context of the 1960s is also one where higher education in Germany more generally and also in other countries grew exponentially. So it's certainly a development that is not that peculiar, but it is interesting to see how the lawyers manage to, you might say, sideline the less strategic colleagues from other disciplines.
I mean, I might just add, there is around the same time, they also installed the Institute for Bildungsforschung, and there is already a proposal on the table by von Weizsäcker for the Institute for Research into the Lebensbedingungen im technologischen Wandel, or something like this it was called. But I guess the point I wanted to make is that, yes, there are other social sciences and humanities that enter the Max Planck Society, but it's the lawyers who actually have this new logic of complementarity, where they basically say, well, criminal law is missing, so we need to add this one. And once this has been established, they keep saying, well, we need to add another institute because we're missing out in our portfolio. That was very smart.
Yes, and obviously today we have reached a stage where we do collectively resemble almost what you would find in a law school in terms of the in the disciplinary spread. But now Alexei has finished his typing, so I read his question. For the benefit of people who didn't used to share an office with you, that's an insight, I suppose. Could you explain the Harnack principle and how it guides the Max Planck Society in its development?
Yes.
Just briefly, he adds.
Yes, so basically the idea in the Harnack principle is that the Max Planck Society finds the best people in a field and gives them an institute and leaves them to do whatever they deem best. So if they find an Einstein, they give Einstein an institute, and if Einstein now decides to do art history, then so be it, because it's the Harnack principle, right? We are putting money in personalities. But once you have this is my twist on it, once you have this faculty logic for the lawyers, I mean, I'm not trying to say that you don't deserve your directorship, but it is certainly the case that now you're trying to represent a spectrum, and that it becomes more of well, you could say a certain path dependency then kicks in. Once a position becomes open, you actually have to fill that position rather than, oh, maybe we can just dedicate this institute to something completely different.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. But although having said that, whenever an institute or even a department at an institute becomes vacant because a director retires, each time a case has to be made for retaining that particular discipline or sub-discipline. But of course, you're totally right. Once an institute exists, it's much more difficult to abolish the entire institute or departments. Oh, now questions are coming in. So we've got Alexandra Kemmerer asking, has the idea of complementarity also contributed to the relative institutional stability over time of the various legal institutes within the Max Planck Society?
I would say yes, simply because especially the two old institutes, so Heidelberg and Hamburg, have always been regarded as a sort of almost like a public good. They had the highly specialized libraries. They were writing expert opinions for German courts whenever foreign and international law was concerned. So in a sense, they marketed themselves as a sort of we are an institution within German legal scholarship. We're one of the pillars here, and we need to be maintained regardless of who is the director. Then there's a question on whether 1968 has influenced legal scholarship in the Max Planck Society. Yes and no. So there is a remarkable conservatism to some respect in the Max Planck Society. They're not, I wouldn't call them the avant-garde lawyers of that time in terms of the student movement. However, there is a clear shift in, for example, in Hamburg, in the research that is undertaken there's much more focus after 1968 on family law, for example. Konrad Zweigert installs a research group that tries to implement social sciences methods and legal sociology. So things start to develop, and it's also probably no coincidence that after 1969, criminology enters the Freiburg Institute, which Ježek had been a bit hesitant about that at first. But as I said, the Max Planck lawyers at that time were not necessarily the big, the revolutionary group. And then the concept of a cluster, well, yes and no. So the humanities section is not a cluster, because the humanities section is an administrative unit by the Max Planck Society. In our research program, when we try to write the history of the Max Planck Society, we try to get rid of those official terms and official categories, and we try to look at structures that are not resembled in the administration, but that are more how can I put it? So wherever astrophysics work together, and if that keeps occurring very frequently, and if they keep supporting each other in commissions and committees, then we call that a cluster. It's basically a research field that moves into the Max Planck Society, and you could actually see it both ways. It's either the Max Planck Society who says, well, this is something we need to practice, and therefore we invest in it. But at the same time, it's also a strategy by the field, saying there is the Max Planck Society, it has these generous funds. Now we are selling our projects to the Max Planck Society and trying to get funding. And to be honest, the lawyers were quite good at that.
Okay, thank you very much. There's no question that has popped up yet. So I'm doing what every conference chair at this moment would do, and say, please continue the conversation over drinks. Thank you very much for this fascinating insight into a project that looks a little bit dry at the outset, because people tend to think that institutional histories are very boring, but of course institutions are full of people. And I think your lecture has really presented this very well. Now, I've been tasked with concluding the day's formal program, but with a reminder that people are very welcome to stick around, simply not log off, and join the cocktails, the virtual cocktails that are scheduled in breakout rooms later. Now, I'm a little bit pessimistic after my earlier experience this afternoon with the breakout rooms, but let's hope that it works. I do have with me a bottle of Mosel Riesling, which is waiting to be opened. No cocktails, unfortunately. We only have a tea kitchen that's not professionally equipped. So everyone is particularly welcome to rejoin or just hang on until 6:30, when the breakout rooms will be opened. Please remember that tomorrow we start at 8:30, but that you will need a different link, a webinar link, which you have already been sent by Russell Miller. He's already summarized briefly before this session the intellectual delights that we're going to expect tomorrow morning. I really think this is going to be extremely interesting, and I'm not even a public lawyer. So actually it promises to be a fascinating showcase of the breadth of research that we've now achieved within this cluster that has just been presented to us. So by thanking Jasper Kunstreich for the wonderful lecture, I'm as I said, closing the formal program and hope to see at least some of you for cocktails in 7 minutes at 6:30. Thank you very much and see many of you tomorrow.